Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Oz Table Talk. My name's Luke. I'm at the table with Ben, Steve, and we have a special guest with us, Dr. Don Batten. Welcome to the table.
Thanks, Luke.
Thanks for going through a long drive to get here.
So. That's right, especially for you.
Yeah, especially for me. That's right. The truth of the matter is, you're doing a presentation tomorrow at one of the churches locally here, and I thought that was an opportunity I couldn't spare. So I reached out and asked if you'd be willing to come on the show, and here you are.
Yep.
So before we get into the topics at hand, just to give people a bit of a picture of who you are, why you're here, where you're from, could you in your own words describe who you are and what you do?
How long you got? Well, I had a career in research, in agricultural research, and so I have a Ph.D. in plant biology. Mm-hmm. As a Christian, I struggled somewhat with the whole evolutionary part of my university training. But came to understand how that does fit together with the Bible and with my faith, and then I ended up involved in a Christian ministry, which is now called Creation Ministries International, and that ministry helps other Christians in that same area where I struggled. And so I'm actually currently the managing director for the Australian branch of that ministry. We have ministry branches in the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, the UK and Europe and South Africa, and also a new one in Singapore.
Oh, wow.
So we're worldwide. We produce Creation magazine, which goes to about 150 countries around the world, and that's produced in Brisbane in Queensland. So, yeah,
that's so cool. That is fantastic. You mentioned that the struggle and going through that experience for yourself. Were you born into a Christian home? Was that your original experience?
Not really. I mean, I was born in the 1950s. You can probably see that. And at that time, almost everybody was connected with the church of some description. And so as somebody, 80% of kids at that time were sent along to church, to Sunday school or Sabbath school or whatever, to have some religion input, because it makes them better kids, They're better behaved, So that was the sort of mentality. Yeah. It wasn't to make sure they become, devout Christians and missionaries and all that sort of thing. That was furthest from the thoughts of many parents. Yeah. But just to make them better kids. And so I was sent along to Sunday school, a local church, and so there was input there. And I don't think I ever in my life thought of there not being a God. Even before I was a Christian, I believed there was a creator who made everything. It seemed logical. Yeah. But of course the evolutionary thing at university tries to teach you that you can live life without God.
And what was the experience with that? Like, what were the first things that challenged your basic assumptions of a creator? Well,
probably more sort of challenging what the Bible says. So the Bible's history, Genesis, the first 11 chapters of Genesis, if evolutionary story is true, the first 11 chapters you've got to throw them out. Or you reinterpret them in such a woolly fashion that they don't say much at all about anything, except religious stuff. Yeah. Nothing that connects with the real world. And of course, if you read it with an open mind, it's clearly talking about real things that really happened. It's not just metaphor, something like that. So that's sort of challenge. And then, so I had this naive idea that science, everything I was learning in science was sort of factual, that it had been well established through experimentation, and you really couldn't, you didn't have permission to not believe it. You know what I mean? Yeah. So you sort of try to take it on board and say, well, how can I integrate that into what I understand about the Bible? And so you ask pastors and Christian leaders, and you read books and things, and they've got no idea really. They weren't very helpful. Yeah. And so I sort of ended up with this really mishmash of stuff like, well, maybe the days could have been long periods of time, or maybe, pastors would put this idea that there was a gap between the first couple of verses of Genesis, and you shove all the hundreds of millions of years into the gap there, and God recreated everything in the 6 days of creation week, and the reason we don't have dinosaurs anymore because he decided they weren't such a good idea, etc. Yeah. There's all sorts of versions of this, but basically. So there's all these different ideas, and the Genesis is some sort of metaphor. It's not meant to be taken as real history, and that's a popular idea at present. So all these sort of ideas are running around in my head, and I'm trying to sort of work out how to put it all together. And in the end, I just sort of it's too hard. I'll become a New Testament Christian.
Don't have to deal with the sticky information.
Don't have to deal with the sticky stuff in the Old Testament.
What?
Yeah. A lot of people do it though.
So I joined up with a church which was a New Testament church. New Testament, they just focused on the gospel and New Testament and stuff. The trouble is when you start reading about the good news about Jesus in the New Testament, it keeps referring to what happened in the Old Testament, so you really can't get away from it, 1 Corinthians chapter 15 talks about the first Adam and the last Adam. So the last Adam, Jesus, comes to fix up what the first Adam did. And we're all descendants of the first Adam, so we all share in what he did. And so we all need fixing up. And Jesus, the last Adam, come to do that. Well, if the first Adam was some sort of metaphor, why did Jesus even come?
And that's one of the things. Even Jesus himself treated Genesis as if it was an accurate portrayal of what happened.
Luke 17, he said the flood came and destroyed them all. Well, if the evolution of millions of years is true, then the flood never happened. So Jesus was wrong. Hang on a minute. How does that work?
I was going to say, okay, now you've got God having problems and being wrong and not having the facts straight.
Right? I've seen theologians, academic theologians, say, Jesus was wrong. Because obviously science is right. Jesus was wrong. Hang on a minute, but in John 10, Jesus said, I only speak what the Father tells me to speak. So if you don't believe me, you don't believe the Heavenly Father. So how's that work? It doesn't. Everything unravels. So, and I think the big breakthrough to me was to understand, I heard an American scientist come and spoke at the University of Sydney when I was doing my postgrad work, and I thought that looks interesting, went along, and he spoke about, first time I'd heard a scientist get up and actually defend believing the Bible's history in Genesis. And the big thing that opened it up for me is to read a book about the Genesis flood. Because a lot of people just focus on Genesis chapter 1, 6 days, other days, has it fit with millions of years, etc., etc. But what about the rest of the Bible? How's the rest of the Bible interpret Genesis? And what about Genesis 3, about the fall, death, suffering and disease came through sin, through the rebellion against God? And what about the flood? Genesis 6, 7, 8, 9, about the flood. I mean, did that happen? How does that impact how we understand the world today? Would that create fossils and rocks and things that people have interpreted as being millions of years old that actually happened in a year's flood? And so it sort of opened up the whole thing. Hang on a minute, there's another way of thinking about all this, Same facts.
Different interpretation.
Different interpretation, and something I never thought of, I think, hang on a minute, there's another way of looking at all this. And it still start to open up. And now I start to realise that actually I could believe the Bible's history.
Wow, and so that sort of put you on the rails that...
Where I am now.
Led you straight through to here. Wow.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't obviously want to open up for you guys too if you want to jump in with anything. But one of the things that you did mention in there was this concept of the 7 days being 7 long periods of time, and that was one question that came from a few of different listeners of ours that they wanted to hear you answer. So how do you reconcile that? Like, what's wrong with that way of interpreting Genesis?
Well, let's go back to what's wrong with it for the gospel, right? Because any scheme we use to try and marry millions of years of time with the Bible, the millions of years are not some sort of abstract concept. They're meant to be the age of the rocks under our feet. And that means the age, and the rocks contain fossils, which are the remains of once living things. And those fossils are millions of years old. That means they predated Adam and Eve. That means death, suffering and disease and cancer and things were in the world before Adam and Eve sinned and brought about the fall, the dislocation of everything. And Romans 8 talks about the whole creation is in bondage to decay. God didn't create it in bondage to decay. It became that way because of the rebellion, sin. And so all the schemes, not just a day-age idea, but the gap theory, and it's just metaphor or whatever, they're God's days of revelation is another idea. Any scheme which wants to marry the Bible with the millions of years puts death, suffering and disease before the fall, which undermines the gospel.
That's right, because if death predated sin, then what is the logic of sin producing death? Which is what the gospel is predicated on.
Why did Jesus die physically on the cross if physical death wasn't the consequence of sin? And as someone trying to believe in the millions of years and the Bible, I had to say that Adam's sin brought about spiritual death only. Physical death was already here. And then And then we have questions like, well, you know, if God is so good, how come there's death and suffering in the world? That's probably number one or two question that people ask, you know, and Christians included.
Yeah.
So what's the answer? Well, the biblical answer is God didn't create a world of death and suffering. It was very good. It was paradise. It was perfect. It became otherwise because of sin. And so that's why Jesus, and we say, well, how bad is sin? How much we need Jesus. And so the other thing, though, is what does it say in Genesis, the Hebrew, Genesis 1? See, the word day in English, how do we interpret it? You know, can a day mean some sort of indefinite period of time? Yes, it can. Like in English, we say, in my father's day, he would do this or that. That meant when my father lived. So Hebrew is almost exactly the same as English in the way it uses the word day. So Genesis 2 verse 4 says, in the day that God created the heavens and the earth, means not that he created it in a day, but in the period of time that he created everything. Okay. So we go back to Genesis chapter 1. What period of time did he use? There was evening and morning, one day. This is what it literally says in Hebrew, Yom Echad, one day. There was evening and morning one day, evening and morning a second day, evening and morning a third day, evening and morning a fourth day, a fifth day, a sixth day, and the seventh day rest. And then we go over to Exodus chapter 20 verse 11, and it says, God's giving the Sabbath commandment to Moses, and he says, I created the heavens, the earth, the seas, and everything in them in 6 days, and rest on the seventh. So you're to work for 6 and rest for 1. We don't work for 6 million years and rest for 1. So
the millennium.
in a strange period of time also that was demarcated by an evening and a morning. A million years would be demarcated by a million evenings and mornings, not one. So the Bible could not be clearer that this is 6 ordinary days. Actually, not so ordinary because lots of stuff happened.
But time-wise.
We're talking about six ordinary days. With a 7th day rest, the base 7-day week. That's where we get a 7-day week from. Plain as day, what it means.
So I know a little bit of your stories as well, and for us at the table, I know it's obviously been a big feature of your life, but as you know, people who have gone through tertiary education, how was evolution presented to you guys? Like, was that something that was much the same? Was it presented as just the assumed?
Well, I also
response?
went through the public education system, so it's a case of it was just fact, and there's no wriggle room at all. And but the funny thing is, when you compare it to what they teach today, they in schools, they at least when I went through, they were teaching it more the old-fashioned Darwinism, which I thought was interesting. Because have you found that there's a big difference when they do teach that sort of thing? There's what's cutting edge as far as with the evolution theory versus what they actually teach a lot of the time?
There's a lot of old stuff that's out of fashion, out of date, even not accepted by evolutionary scientists that's taught. But the other thing is that the whole neo-Darwinism is predicated on 2 things, mutations and natural selection. Mutations are supposed to create all the genetic information that makes it possible for one kind of creature to change into another, or one kind of organism to change into another. And then natural selection is supposed to select the favourable mutations to drive that towards, some higher order. But over the years, they've come to realise that mutations really aren't an adequate answer to this question of the origin of the genetic information, because the whole molecular biology revolution of the last 50 years it's created such a problem for the neo-Darwinist idea of mutations creating all the new information. So the modern curriculum downplays mutations.
Okay, yep.
They almost ignore them, and they concentrate on examples of natural selection. And say, look at this, natural selection works here and here and here and here. Evolution must be a fact. It's actually a con. It's actually an absolute con, because natural selection can only select from what's already there. It doesn't create anything. In fact, natural selection gets rid of information.
Extinct species.
You get extinct species. You get loss of traits that aren't suitable for survival. Natural selection doesn't create anything. Only mutations can do it. They know that if they tell children that accidental changes to existing information creates new information, they'll think, hang on a minute, when I do an accidental change when I'm typing on my computer, I don't get new information, I get a mess.
Yeah.
How do
That's
mutations create new information? So they downplay the whole thing, the mutations, to try and push it down, because I think they know that the kids will wake up to the fact that it's a con.
Yeah, because I found it very challenging, because I hadn't actually been taught creation theory at that point. And that's actually what brought me back around to Christianity. And yeah, one of the things they actually brought up to try and counter that was this, some people coined it as the Pokemon theory, where the idea is all these changes happen in the background, and within a generation or two, it'll just completely change. And
yeah, the hopeful monster theory.
yeah, it's the more I looked at it, the more ridiculous it began to. It's just I couldn't get my head around it. And then when I was looking through the creation theories, it's just that whole idea that the data can actually be interpreted very differently. One particular caught my interest was, of course, the Grand Canyon, which is usually such a a very pro-evolutionist.
Well, it's an icon for millions of years.
Yeah. But then actually learning that such formations can be created with fast water flows. The water pulls it out, and they're very fast mud flows. And if you look at the fossils, ultimately it's whatever is, one, caught in the mud flow, but two, their buoyancy plays a part as well.
To create any fossil, you need lots of mud. And there's very few. In fact, Dr. Ron Neller is one of our staff these days, and he had 30 years plus experience in universities. He's a geomorphologist. Big word, but it's basically how the geological history affects the morphology or shape of the landscape. And so he's a flood chaser, basically. So his specialty is all around the world. He studied floods. And the thing that actually brought him to faith in Christ was remembering his back in when he was a child, being taught about Noah and the flood, and then a life of not being a Christian, and then he thinks everywhere he goes he sees evidence for one flood. But all his colleagues, all his secular colleagues, and himself being encouraged to do this, say, no, there's multiple floods, not just one. Well, why not just one flood? Well, the Bible talks about that. So, and basically there's so much evidence for one flood, but not only that, but to create fossils, there's no process on the Earth today that actually produces enough sediment to actually create fossils.
Yeah, because doesn't erosion often outdo the rate at which new sediment comes down?
You get a typical flood, like a river floods or even a tsunami. The amount of sediment is not enough to bury anything other than something very tiny. And you find fossils of horses and whales and all sorts of huge creatures, and dinosaurs, many are dinosaurs, of course, and a lot of them are buried, and all their bones are lying there basically as they were, intact, not even spread around. Now, there are ones that are spread around, disarticulated, but a lot of them are actually buried intact. And a fish buried with the scales on and everything, think it takes a lot of mud.
Yeah.
And you don't see, there's no process on Earth today that generates that sort of mud.
And also a lot of speed too.
It has to happen quickly, otherwise they rot.
I remember, because when I was a kid, I used to read Creation magazine, and I remember one of the things that really stood out in my mind as a kid was a photo of a fossilized, I can't remember what dinosaur it was, but it was in the process of giving birth.
Oh, that's the ichthyosaur. It's
Ichthyosaur,
actually
there it is.
A marine reptile,
Yeah. And I remember seeing that
one.
As a child, I saw that and I thought, wow, like that is just really interesting, like for so many reasons, right? Like that was just a fascinating thing, really stuck in my mind.
Yeah. Yeah, so it'd be a long labour if it took millions of years.
So why do you think that people of science who claim to be intellectually honest deceive themselves, or like deliberately ignore, like your colleague saying, like he's just saw naturally without a biased perspective? If not, he was like counter trained to not be looking for that, and he was like, well, there's just evidence for it. Like, why are scientific people looking at the evidence and not drawing the conclusion that's clear?
It's not just about the evidence, that's why.
Yeah.
It's a spiritual thing. And so, it goes back to Genesis and Adam. What did he do? He said, well, virtually effectively told God to get lost. I'm going to do things my way. Mm-hmm. And that's sin. And sin drives the human psyche to run away from God. Mm-hmm. And so the thing is that unless the Holy Spirit really impacts upon you, like Ron, he realised that, hang on a minute, that means the Bible's true. That means, hang on a minute, I'm accountable for my sin. Hey, hang on a minute, I need a saviour.
The ramifications stack up.
Right? The ramifications, that's right. There's a chain of reasoning, which flies from here to here. And I think a lot of academic people know that they don't want to get to here.
Yeah, okay. So they see that, they just don't get here.
They don't want to get to here.
Yeah.
So they're not going to take that step. Mm. And look, I wouldn't call them dishonest.
Okay.
There are dishonest academics, and I've seen plenty of it, but I think a lot are ignorant.
Okay.
I think a lot of, like you were saying, you only heard one side of the story. Mm-hmm. And so you are open to the other side of the story. Mm-hmm. But many only hear one side of the story, and they've been told over and over again that the other side is ridiculous. You don't even have to think about that.
Mm-hmm. So identity politics, isn't it really?
Well, it's a similar thing. Yeah. You just shut down the alternative, and ridicule, shame. This is one of the things that some of the politicians agree about creation. They agree that the evolution shouldn't be taught to kids the way it is in schools, but they won't say anything about it because they know that the media will be on their back like a ton of bricks. Oh, you believe in a flat Earth, do you? That sort of stuff,
Because that's a logical progression. But
well, that's what they do.
But that's what they do, though.
That's what they do.
They make the leap.
They make the leap, and you're an idiot. You must believe in a flat Earth as well, So they shut down the debate by ridicule and by this sort of shaming, cancel culture. You've seen it all with the gender bending stuff, So there's sort of ignorance. There's a willful ignorance, which you touched upon, which is I don't want to go there because I know what that means. But the thing is we've got to share, I think, the information with people. And there was one guy I remember reading his testimony, and he was an academic at university in South Africa, and his wife challenged him one day. She knew nothing about the science. He was a geneticist, you think he had it all up here. I don't understand how evolution works, And his wife said something, and he got angry, because what he knew what she said was true, but he didn't want to admit it. But he went away, and he started thinking about what she said, and think she's right. She's absolutely right,
Must have been a painful moment for the poor guy.
Painful moment. Here's this guy with a Ph.D. in genetics, and his wife was a layman, and she said something which made perfect sense, and it actually ended up resulting in him overturning his whole thinking. So it became a geneticist understanding that actually the evidence stacks up for creation.
Sorry.
I was going to say, do you want to start getting into some of the...
Well, we've actually been dealing with them just organically, so I've just been letting that roll. So
cross.
Yeah, and as I'm going, I'm like, okay, that's the answer to that one, and that's the answer to that one. So one that I was just looking at is, how old do you believe the Earth? Let me try that again. How old do you believe the Earth is?
So we can only know from an eyewitness account. It's like, how do you know how old you are? Well, there were a couple of people who witnessed your birth, and they signed a birth certificate. And we have a birth certificate for the universe, and that's in the Bible. And that's the only way we can know. And the Bible actually does give us not a precise age, in the sense that we can say it's 6005 BC or something like that, or years ago, I mean. But it gives us the genealogies in Genesis 5, the age at which Adam and Eve had their children, and the age at which their children had children, and the age at which their children had children, all the way down to Noah. And then in Genesis 11, we have further genealogy down to Abraham. And then, of course, right through the Old Testament, they all link up. And so you've got a continuous time frame. Which gives you about 6,000 years, could be up to about 8,000 or 9,000, with a few provisos. Because obviously, there's one obvious one, and that is that If every person was born in January of the year, right, or every person was born in December of the year,
so you've got 12 months of wiggle room
that's
for
right.
each
You've got
generation.
12 months of wiggle room to start with
Yeah.
for each generation. So let's not be too,
Yeah, that makes good sense.
But you see, and so scientifically, we can't actually be sure how old things are because you can do measurements in the present, but to get an age, you have to assume a history. That's the fundamental problem. So if you didn't know how old I was, you look at me. So you look a bit aged. You're not obviously not 10. Maybe you could possibly be between anything between 60 and 80. Depending on how much time you spend out in the sun.
Yeah.
You can sort of make it a guess, but it'd be a guess. But if you have that birth certificate, you know. And so we know. So when we get things like so-called scientific dating,
I was going to say, what about carbon-14 dating, which is dating? What most people would say, well, we actually can know because we can do this.
Yeah, well, you say take carbon dating, for example. And by the way, when someone says to you, carbon dating proves things are millions of years old, you know straight away they know nothing about it. Because
you have to assume the amount to begin with.
Well, no. The reason is that carbon dating doesn't work on millions of years. It only works on thousands of years as far as it works. Because carbon-14, the radioactive carbon-14 that's used for dating, it breaks down. So the way it works is that it's a bit like you've got a bucket and you've got a hole in it, right, and the water's leaking out. And so you can measure the rate at which the water leaks out of the bucket and then you can say, well, the bucket's down so far, it's 5 litres is gone, and I measured the rate and it's 50 millilitres per hour is coming out of the bucket at the bottom. How long has it been running for? So that gives you when it started. So hang on a minute, but do you know the bucket was full to start with?
So you don't know the original levels, so
you don't know the original levels.
You can't guarantee that.
So you've got to make an assumption that it was full. Or you've got to make an assumption also that the
decay rate's the same.
The rate at the bottom's the same. It hasn't changed, So you've got to make these assumptions to date things. But the thing is that carbon-14 has a half-life of 5,730 years at present. That's what we measured at present. And that's operational, real science. You can do that in a lab. And then you've got to assume it's been unchanged in the past. And then you've got to you make these assumptions. Now, you can calibrate the carbon-14 with, say, like tree ring dating and things like that, back so far. And so you can get a reasonably good idea. And you can also got historical dates, like you know that somebody was born in or died in 66 AD, from other sources. And here's the remains of this guy. You can test him for carbon-14. So, well, there's a fix for that.
Yeah, so you've actually got
you've got some checks.
Yeah, checks, yeah.
Checks, right. Now, even within that, there's still things like certain organisms discriminate against carbon-14 because it's a bit different to carbon-12, carbon dioxide, for example. So things like algae are a bit different to land plants. And so you've got to make these adjustments and But the thing is, it only works for thousands of years. And here's the problem for their millions of years story. You can get fossils that go right back 600 million years, coal, shells, all sorts of things, and you can find carbon-14 in them. It shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
If they're millions
the
of
bucket,
years.
so to speak, should be empty by then.
The bucket should be empty by then.
Yeah.
The bucket should be well and truly empty by then. In fact, if the whole Earth were carbon-14 and nothing else, in 1 million years there'd be nothing left. It's all changed to nitrogen-14.
Wow.
Just 1 million years.
And
So how come it's in all these things? And not only that, but diamonds, which are supposed to be billions of years old, have carbon-14 in them.
Oh, okay.
So you can't put carbon-14 into a diamond after it's made because there's no room for it. All the crystals, all the spots are taken up. That's what makes diamonds so hard. So you can't put carbon-14, you can't contaminate it, in other words. So how come there's carbon-14 in diamonds if they're billions of years old? So there's lots of evidence there's something seriously wrong with the millions and billions of years.
So-
Other techniques give millions and billions of years, like uranium lead dating, and there's all sorts of things like that. But they're contradicted by the carbon dating.
So the obvious question to me, I am not a highly educated person. I do not have my Ph.D. in any of these things.
But you got a PhD in life skills.
Yeah, but my point is, what you just explained seems so simple. it doesn't take a PhD
No.
to see that makes sense. And so I know it's back to the old question that we were having before, but is it really that? Is the answer really that simple as to why people who are expert in these fields are rejecting that information? Because that just seems to be a generally flawed hypothesis, right? A generally flawed test. So why do they still use it, or do they? Or
well,
is it just that it's so ingrained in the culture that they can't let it go?
What underlines the whole thing
Yeah.
is a solid understanding that this is the way it is. The Earth is billions of years old, unquestioned. So the lady, for example, in the United States, Dr. Mary Schweitzer, she's a paleontologist, and she's rather famous for finding all sorts of soft tissues and things in dinosaur fossils. And then when she first found things that look like red blood cells, you look at them under a microscope, and you can look them up, pictures of them on the internet.
Those. Yeah.
Red blood cells, they're donut shaped, just like red blood cells, and so on and so on. And she said, found these things that look like red blood cells.
What else are they going to be?
They looked like red blood cells. It didn't say they were. It looked like red blood cells because she got such pushback from the evolutionary establishment because they can't possibly be red blood cells when they're 65 or 66 million years old. They must be just some sort of fossilised remnant of red blood cells. Anyway, she then went and she found the blood vessel, right? And under the microscope, they dissolved the bone away, and you could actually get the blood vessel and stretch it with a couple of tweezers, a pair of tweezers under, and you could see it stretching. So it's still stretchy. And anyway, then the evolutionary establishment, and she's an evolutionist, strangely, they went into overdrive. Oh, it must be bacterial biofilm that's actually invaded the bone after it fossilised. So there's always a rescue device, a rescue hypothesis to try and explain these things without admitting there's a problem with the time frame. And so it must be bacterial biofilm. So she went back to the lab and she said, well, let's see what sort of proteins, if we can find some proteins in this fossilised material. Are they bacterial proteins or are they vertebrate proteins, like you'd expect in a dinosaur? She found osteocalcin, which is only in bone, it's not in bacteria. She found lamellin, which joins tissues together in multicellular organisms, not in bacteria. She found... etc., etc., etc.
Yeah.
So she said, "There you go. This is dinosaur tissue. It's not bacterial biofilm." Oh, okay.
Well, the science says it now, right?
But there must be some other explanation, So and so on it goes, So there's no possibility there could be a problem with the age of the bone, and I would say clearly this is clear evidence there's something wrong with the age of the bone.
Yeah. So how prevalent is creationism? Like, as far as the media is concerned, like there is this universal standard of evolutionary understanding, and obviously, you have a PhD, you have studied, many of these things, and you've come to this conclusion, and you're not alone. I know there are obviously others, but how broad is this questioning of evolutionary theory? Is it as minor as the media paints, or is there a lot more questions being asked that we don't necessarily see in public channels?
I think probably 15 years ago there was more public questioning, but it's almost like a circling of the wagons that in academic circles it's like, don't talk about that because the creationists will pick it up, and also, and when we do pick it up and publicise it, of course, then the person who says it gets into trouble from the colleagues. Says, look, you've stepped out of line here and you've given them some, blah, blah, blah. So
it almost sounds like it's become a more oppressive culture as a result.
It's an oppressive culture, and it's not just about this. It's about everything that actually to do with materialism and the whole materialistic culture of academia. It's not just about creation, but it's about the whole gender stuff and cancel culture and socialism, communism, pushing of Marxism at the university. All these things. It's not, but at the core of it, I believe, is the issue of origins. It's the bedrock upon which everything sits. So, if God doesn't exist, then we make the rules and everything follows from that. If God does exist, the Bible's God's word, then we don't have freedom to do whatever we like. And our universities used to be built on that belief. They're not anymore. And consequently, you see the oppression that's coming in But strangely, they think that the Bible's oppressive because there's rules to things, God, you don't do this and don't do that, and that sort of thing. Of course, they don't see, of course, that Jesus said, "I came to have life and have it abundantly," or probably the best translation would be most abundantly.
Yeah.
Sort of abundant beyond what you can imagine. And so the idea of Jesus bringing oppression is just the opposite of reality. But that's what they think, and that's what they propagate with students and the new ones that come in. And so there's this circling the wagons as the materialistic culture that actually pervades the system. And so it's not just... So in a sense, creation is really... They've moved on from that to suppressed it sufficiently that they're onto other things. But there are people like some prominent biologists who privately admit there's a crisis in terms of explaining the origin of life, and a crisis in terms of explaining the diversity of life, and also the incredible nanotechnology that's being discovered inside living things. The sophistication of the biological machines that are being found. The ATP synthase, the kinesin, the bacterial flagellum. I mean, the DNA, the gyrase that unwinds the DNA so it can be read. The DNA polymerase, which has been in the news recently with the coronavirus, and you can take a little tiny part of the RNA and you can multiply it with RNA polymerase. This enzyme that's used for that is just phenomenal. It's just an amazing machine. And you think, well, if you had a machine that copied my phone, you think that's a pretty impressive machine, you know.
Yeah, that's true.
But this machine copies the RNA and says, "Oh, it just evolved." Really?
And I guess if you rewind to very early evolutionary theory, you go back to the times of Charles Darwin and that.
They didn't know about this stuff.
Yeah, I was going to say they didn't actually have an understanding of this level of complexity, and so it was a lot more plausible.
And I had no idea.
Yeah.
And it took root before all this stuff was known, and consequently it ought to be in serious crisis. Ought to be in absolute crisis today. Biological evolution really doesn't have a leg to stand on.
Oh yeah, I was gonna ask if intelligent people, scientists, have seen all of this evidence and are not coming to the conclusions that yourself and the people you work with have. Is there a way that we can share, like, the more abundant life that Jesus has in store for us in a way that they will engage with? Because they're clearly not, like, drawing the same conclusions from the evidence or, like, an argumentative perspective.
Yeah, good question. I think 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 1 Peter chapter 3 verse 15 to be ready with an answer. Always be ready with an answer for the faith that we have, for the hope that we have within us. But then it says, but do this with gentleness and respect. And so I think we, when we get the opportunity, we need to challenge their thinking, but do it in a way. We're not trying to win an argument. We're not trying to bash them over the head. We're not trying to, beat them into submission. We're trying to share with them something which is of eternal importance for them. It's because I love you that I want to share this with you. I don't want to win an argument. I don't want to beat you. I want to see you enjoy what God's got for you. That's what you're getting at. There's no good just winning an argument. And you can win an argument, and then the person goes away and hates you.
I guess that's my point.
So just a question, and this kind of ties into what we were talking about while we were having dinner before we started recording, but one of the questions that was actually shared by a friend of mine who is very strongly convinced by evolution is how, like, as a scientist, his question was, is it appropriate to mix supernatural and natural evidence? And so I'm curious how you think about that as a scientist, as someone in the field. How do you think about that?
Yeah, so one of the things that's done today, a lot of theological colleges, is to try and separate faith and science, or you might say faith and facts, and try to make out that they're entirely different fields of thought, and therefore you can keep them separate, like some sort of, you put them in different boxes, and you just keep them separate, keep the boxes separate, and everything will be fine. But the problem is that the Bible's a book of history. It's a big book of things that actually happened. It's God's work in history. And unlike any other book, it tells us the future. Tells us the past, but also tells us the future. And the future depends on the past. So it's all an integrated whole. And so when you try and separate the theology from history, which is what we're talking about here. I mean, what happened in the evolution is about what happened in the past. It's not a scientific theory in the sense of something you can test in a laboratory. It's a belief about what happened in the past. And the cosmic evolution is a belief about how everything came to be without God. The whole universe came to be without God. So it's a belief about what happened in the past without God. That's the whole point of it. It does away with God. And so I would say science should be about following the evidence wherever it leads. So if it leads to the conclusion there must be a supernatural creator behind this, then that is a valid conclusion. When we talk about history, and this is a valid conclusion. Now, it's not appropriate, of course, if you're doing a chemistry experiment in a laboratory, to pray that God will make the result what you want it to be.
Yeah. That wouldn't work very well.
That's not going to work.
Yeah.
And I don't think God would honour that.
No.
At all. That would be, I think he would say, you're being stupid.
Yep. Yeah. But then it is very interesting because it's one of the things that I think that if we want to start from the perspective of having a God, like for those of us who are already Christian, it only makes sense that if he created the world, that there should be overlapping of the two disciplines, right? As you said, like the facts and the faith.
Yeah.
It makes sense for there to be an overlap because otherwise it might be beneficial, like Christianity or belief, faith in whatever form, may be beneficial psychologically, but if it doesn't ever get as far as the real world, then what do you really have, And I think this is shown, fast forward later in Scripture, think about the plan of redemption, think about Jesus' death and burial and resurrection. If we don't have facts around Jesus' resurrection...
Did that really happen?
If that didn't really happen, well then... What if even Paul says we are of all men most pitiable? Because
that's right.
That if we don't have a risen Savior, then what's the point of the whole exercise?
That's right. Yeah.
So facts and faith have to overlap if we have a reasonable faith.
Yeah.
And coming from the opposing perspective, just like you said, if we have evidence that supports the idea of having a creator, then what's wrong with reaching that conclusion? And I think that this is... It's like Occam's razor, right? The least, the least assumptions are what you're looking for, and if the least assumptions leads us to the place where we're looking at a creator, then it's a reasonable thing for us to examine, even if we're not going to say. And I don't have a problem if someone's going to say, "Oh well, I don't believe in a personal God and all the rest of it," but just to be open to saying, well, it's a possible conclusion that we can look at the evidence and see if we can arrive at that place.
Sure,
makes sense to me,
absolutely,
right?
Yeah. And I don't think too many people would be too happy about just believing in something because it makes them feel good.
Yeah.
They want to be convinced it's true. In spite of postmodernism, postmodernism tries to say that it doesn't matter if it's true and your truth's not my truth. There's not many people that live by that. It's that's really the stuff of madness. We all want to actually believe what we believe is actually true, not just that it feels good.
Objective reality.
Objective reality, and the fact the whole thing about the Christian gospel is, and right through the New Testament, and resting on the Old, is these things really happened. They're not just somebody's made up story, and. So it's really important. And as I say, the resurrection, did it really happen? If it didn't really happen, well, we might as well go off and do something else.
Yeah, exactly. Just one question that did come up that I thought would be an interesting one to ask you. What evidence would you personally require to change your position, hypothetically?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. If I said to you, could you prove my wife doesn't exist?
I've never observed her. I can't see her, so therefore she doesn't exist.
Does she exist?
There you go.
Yeah.
But I know she exists because I know her.
Mm.
I live with her.
Yeah.
I relate to her. I know she exists. So you couldn't prove to me that she doesn't exist. You might never have seen her. You might not know even what her name is.
Mm-hmm.
But I know her personally. And so you can't prove she doesn't exist.
Yeah. Mm.
So, and this rolls back to something, somebody says, oh, you're narrow-minded, saying that, that this is about the Bible's God's word and blah, blah, blah. So hang on a minute. The materialist says, no matter what the evidence, it's got nothing to do with God. And my position as a scientist says, if the evidence says natural processes can produce this, then that's fine by me.
Yeah.
If the evidence says there must be a super intelligent creator behind this, then that's okay by me. Who's the narrow-minded one? The materialist is a narrow-minded one, only allowing the evidence to speak one thing and not allowing it to say anything else.
That would be like a court of law prohibiting any evidence that would incriminate the accused, right?
Yeah, having a court of law where there's only the accusation without the defence.
Yeah. Yeah, which we would find laughable and untenable in our society, but we seem to be okay with doing that in the science fields.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So they brought in a rule about materialism, that science is about materialism. And in operational science, that is what we do in the lab, we test things and experiments and chemistry experiments and all sorts of stuff and working out how these incredible nano machines work inside living things. I mean, these things are matters which we know the way they operate is explicable in terms of chemistry and physics, but their origin isn't.
Yeah.
That's the thing. And nobody observed the origin. But we can see that the mind behind these things is just super intelligent. Like, we come along and we think, aren't these scientists clever to work out how this stuff works? Yeah, well, could they ever have invented it? No.
Yeah, we think they're clever for being able to observe it.
To work out how it works. That's amazing,
Yeah.
But what about the one who invented it?
Yeah.
I just made it self.
I mean, how many of our technologies are actually based on things in nature?
A lot of things, yeah.
Yeah, we grab it and we just try and make it our own.
Try and copy it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One
I saw one the other day was the new glue they've developed. It's sort of combination between abalone and barnacles. So they're both very good at grabbing onto things and being very difficult to remove. And somebody's worked out a glue based on both of them that can be used by us.
Okay.
Just hot off the press a couple of days ago.
There you go. Yeah.
But ultimately, it's still
And it works underwater.
Oh, that's
Not many glues work underwater.
No, that's true.
But ultimately, it's kind of borrowed technology.
That's just borrowed technology, yeah.
One of the questions we were discussing last night was the difference in, say, genetic change versus genetic variation. There was a question that didn't seem to know that there was a difference. So I thought that was interesting. So
You mean like natural selection versus actually changing species to species, sort of?
Yeah. So I was just thinking if you could explain genetic variance. So
So you look at so one of the classic things they use is Darwin's finches on the Galapagos Islands, and they look at all the different species of finches, and they've got different shaped beaks adapted to different sorts of food. And depending on the availability of food, depends on which finches do better or worse in different seasons. And so some species build up when there's lots of rain, lots of insects, and another one builds up when there's a dry season, and the only stuff available is big seeds that the ones that are good at getting insects can't break open the seeds, but ones with big fat beaks, they can break open the big seeds, so they do better. So the populations come and go depending on the availability of food. So you see adaptation happening here, you see natural selection happening here. But the thing is that they're still finches. They're just varieties of finches. Like we look at people and say, even tonight we've got different shaped beaks. We're not evolving into something else. So the trick there is, though, they say, look at these varieties of finch. And again, they're concentrating on natural selection. But you say, well, hang on a minute. The belief from evolution now is that a T-Rex-like creature evolved into birds. So you think a T-Rex-like creature became a finch. What's the evidence for that? There's none. But of course, God didn't make finches, so it must have happened. So you see how this concept of this variation within a created kind. I would say the finches are a created kind. God created finches. There might be a slightly bigger group which includes other birds. I haven't really looked at this in detail. But finches certainly are one created kind. And within the created kind, God made things with the ability to adapt to different sorts of situations. So this is variation within a kind. And this is not a new idea. This I actually discovered just last week, in the 1600s, there was a British guy, an English guy, who wrote about this, the idea that God's created kinds are actually bigger than just a species. And this is before they even had the concept of species in terms of genus and species.
Yeah.
So, and he actually talked about different types of cats and different sorts of birds and things like that, different varieties of doves and things. And so this idea is not a new idea, sort of invented to try and counteract evolution.
Yeah.
It actually predates Darwin and everything. 200 years before Darwin, this guy was writing about this, you know. So, so the concept we have today is just like that, that God created, say, a wolf kind. And within the wolf kind, you've got jackals and dingoes and coyotes, and you've got the domestic dogs and everything from Great Dane through to Chihuahua. All this variety is possible within a created kind without adding new genetic information, in the sense of adding new features that weren't there to start with. They've all got the same features. They're just bigger or smaller.
They're all still four legs. They bark. They bite.
That's exactly right.
Furry.
An incredibly similar psyche.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Except the smaller they are, the more they bite.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you see how this variety within the created kind. So the evolutionists pick up that, and they say, like the finches, and they say, well, there you are, it's evolution. And it's just it's a bait and switch fallacy to try and get students to believe in evolution based on something which actually doesn't demonstrate evolution. They need to demonstrate that a dinosaur could change into a finch or some other sort of bird, or other sorts of birds. You know, ducks could change into finches. You know, that's not going to work either.
So just for, I guess, putting some clarity around one of the points that you're stating is that, like, as Christians, and this plays into one of the questions that was actually asked, that saying, is it possible to recognize elements of evolution, or Darwinism, like natural selection and adaptation, without undermining Scripture?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. God created different kinds of things in our world with the ability to adapt to different environments. So you've got Arctic wolves, which have tiny little ears and furry. They've got white fur, and they're very hairy, and they've got some other adaptations which enable them to survive in really cold conditions. You've got African wolves with big ears to radiate heat, less hair, etc. So they've got different features for different conditions. But
so you would say that there's a line, right? So natural selection can only push them so far.
Yeah, well, that's right. I mean, even artificial selection. See, we were coming over here today, my wife was asking me about sugar beet. So cane sugar, grown around here, is a good source of sugar. But in Europe, they didn't want to buy our sugar, so they tried to get sugar beet to produce enough sugar. So they actually started out with about, I think, 7 or 8% sugar in sugar beet, which is pretty poor. And they bred it and bred it and bred it and bred it. I think it got up to about 15% sugar. That's it. They're stopped there. They can't get any further. Yeah. And the reason is they've got all the genes, all the information for sugar that's possible in sugar beet have been got together by the breeding process, and that's it.
Yeah. They've reached the hard biological limit.
They've reached the hard biological limit. You can't go further.
Yeah.
So you can't change sugar beet into sugar cane.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
You know.
See that's kind of what I was looking for. I was looking for an example, and that's a great one. And I'm assuming there'd be a lot more like that.
Heaps of them. Yeah. Heaps of them. Yeah. Yeah. So one of the pushes for genetic modification. So we take gene from another organism and put it in this organism, is to break that barrier, which all breeding comes up against, that natural barrier, that the natural variation possible is limited. And so if you want to get a cotton variety which is going to be resistant to the boll weevil, the bollworm, Heliothus, there's no gene in cotton that can do that. Yeah. But there is one in bacteria that can do it. So they get the one from the bacteria, put it in the cotton, and then the cotton's resistant to the grub.
But that's not something that could have ever possibly happened without our intervention.
Could never have happened without very intelligent scientists doing it.
Right.
So it's an evidence for creation, not evolution.
Yeah. And isn't that interesting how some of the very things that are supposed to be evidence for one often end up being evidence for the other?
Yeah.
Another question that came from the audience, somebody by the name of Hector, asked, so how do we explain the DNA similarities between humans and other species that are supposed to point to a common ancestor?
Yeah. So, of course, the one that's most on people's minds are humans and chimps, because we're supposed to evolve from a common ancestor with chimps about 7 million years ago. So you look at your human and chimp DNA, and the mythology is that we're only 1% different. And so, 1%.
I've seen that on 100 different documentaries, right?
1%'s not much. So, if you get 99% in your maths test, you're pretty good. You're almost 100. It's pretty close to perfect. But 1% difference, if it was true, but just say it was true, 1% difference is a huge difference, because we have 3,000 million DNA chemical letters on our DNA. 3,000 million. So 1%.
1% is a lot of genes out going the wrong way.
Who's the maths guy? 30 million.
Yeah.
1%'s 30 million. Right?
That's
So
a few.
30 million letters is a lot of letters.
Yeah.
So the 1%, even
if you had a book with 30 million letters that weren't what they were supposed to be, you'd have a problem.
Well, 33 billion letters is equivalent to 1,000 Bible-sized books.
Yeah.
Right? So 1% is going to be
It's a lot of information.
30 books.
Yeah, 30 books.
30 books, Bible-sized books.
Mm.
That's a lot of information.
Mm.
And so the 1%'s a big difference. And the problem is, for the evolutionist, is it's actually much more than 1%.
Mm.
The difference is more like, well, it's very difficult to make the comparison, but for a start, 11% doesn't even line up. So that's before you even start comparing them.
Yeah.
So what they did when they got 1% is they got the actual genes that we actually share with chimps. There are plenty. So they got the ones that share with chimps and then they compared those. And that's where they got 99%.
So of the genes we share, 99% of those are precisely the same as ours.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. Well,
But what about the ones we
cherry-picking.
don't share?
That's cherry picking.
There's something like at least about 600 genes that we have that are unique to us. Right? So now here's the rub.
Yeah.
You look up, anybody can look this up, look up waiting time problem on the internet. You'll find a paper by Sanford and a couple of other authors. It was from about 3 or 4 years ago, published in a secular journal, and it's called the waiting time problem. And they got a model which models the movement of genes in a population, like a human population. They made all the assumptions that you would make to make evolution possible in the simulation. And what they found was to get 2 letters lined up, not 30 million, just 2 letters lined up together, side by side, would take 84 million years. 84 million years, 2, and we're supposed to be separated by 7 million years.
Yeah.
In other words,
That's
evolution
fantastically
is
improbable.
impossible.
Yeah.
Not just improbable,
Yeah,
impossible.
Mm.
So any similarities between us and chimps is due to functionality.
Yeah.
And sometimes they say, oh, this is a pseudo gene, it doesn't do anything. Then when someone actually looks at it, they find the pseudo gene actually does something. It isn't functionless at all. So if you had 2 things which truly were of no function, and they were identical between humans and chimps, that would theoretically be pretty good evidence of common ancestry. But here's the problem. Because so many mutations would happen between our separation from chimps and today, if 2 genes are identical, it's actually very good evidence that they are very necessary.
Because why would we be retaining them?
Why would we retain them? Why wouldn't they have mutated to be very different?
Yeah.
So when they look at them and say, well, hang on a minute, and that's what they do actually, even evolutionists look at it and say, well, this is so similar, it must be functional.
So they're answering our own questions on our behalf at that point, right?
Exactly, yeah.
Gotcha. All right, I'm just looking. The only other question that I've got here on the list that I don't think we've crossed over yet is how do we, and you've mentioned a little bit about this, because there's a specific example, I just wanted to come back to the specific example. How do we explain missing link fossil discoveries like Lucy, for example?
So it's interesting, about 4 or 5 years ago in New Scientist, there was a front cover actually had the classical ape to human transition sort of species on a blackboard, and then they rubbed out everything between humans and chimps, or humans and apes, rubbed out everything in between, so including Lucy. So in between an ape and a human, like proconsul or something like that, You got proconsul, you got Lucy, you got Homo habilis, you got Homo erectus, you got Neanderthals, and you got modern humans, right? And that's a sort of classical progression. But it's all up in the air now. Even the evolutionists themselves, there's plenty of evolutionists, paleoanthropologists they're called, that work on this, and they're saying, really, it's all in the melting pot. And so the idea Lucy's our ancestor.
Is that why we're hearing now more that humans, as in Homo sapiens, were just another competing branch? Yeah, that's why we're hearing more of that now.
Yeah,
I have noticed that as well.
Yeah.
Okay. So they're changing their story away from the idea of this progression one to the other to some sort of big bush. You know, with all these different stuff all over the place, and how they all connect together we haven't worked out yet, but one day we will.
Yeah. So it actually ends up sounding a lot more like creation with lots and then reduction in diversity.
That's right. So when it boils down to it, Homo erectus, Neanderthal, and Homo sapiens are humans.
Yeah.
You know, and plenty of evolutionary anthropologists, they agree. In fact, some of them say we should all be called Homo sapiens. They shouldn't even be called different species. And certainly,
they're just different dominant features. Is that like how they
that's
discern?
right. You look at the world's population today, and some people have Neanderthal features.
Yeah.
You know, and they've got, of course, they've got DNA of Neanderthals now, and so Neanderthals. So the DNA of Neanderthals and modern humans there's not much difference. You know, there's some difference, but there's very little. And you can find those DNA similarities in people in the world today of that Neanderthal. So Homo erectus, I don't think there's any DNA of Homo erectus found at present, but I wouldn't be surprised if that will be found. But all the features of Homo erectus below the neck are basically totally human, and above the neck they're just a bit smaller in the skull and different things like that. You know, again, you find people with features like that in the world today. So but
it's still within those
within the variety,
of hard limits, right?
That's within the hard limits of humankind.
Yeah.
And then you've got the one that's actually the whole story depended on Homo habilis. So Lucy, everybody agrees, was very ape-like. The connection with humans is tenuous. The idea that it walked upright, well, it had knuckle walking, wrist bones. It had a pelvis which was clearly designed for swinging around trees. It had all sorts of features which are ape-like. Is a bit different to a chimp, but very similar in many respects. But Homo habilis is the link. And if Homo habilis falls over, the whole story falls over. And that's what's happened. Homo habilis is now recognised as, they call it a waste bin of taxonomic waste bin. So what's happened is when they get a femur or some sort of bone and they're not quite sure, does it look like a modern human, does it look like that, they'll throw it in here. So they actually put all this stuff into this basket.
So it becomes a hybrid of
that's right, that's what's happened.
things.
So they've actually got ape bits and human bits together, and that's Homo habilis. And of course that's obviously it's going to be an ape man if you've got ape and human bits together.
Yeah.
But in fact they don't go together, the bits don't go together. And a number of prominent paleoanthropologists that agree that Homo habilis is this waste bin taxon, or it's actually an invalid taxon, they call it, which means that it never existed. So Homo habilis, where's the connection?
So it evaporates on inspection.
It evaporates on inspection,
Yeah. Okay.
And there are lots of, if you want people to go into detail, I mean, you go to creation.com.
Yeah.
This is a unashamed plug.
Go for it.
Our website.
That was going to be my next question. So you beat me there. I was going to say, tell us where can we... One of our listeners actually asked, can you give us good resources, point us in the right direction? So
so if you go to creation.com, it's very hard to remember. You want stuff about
creation.
You want stuff about creation, go to creation.com.
Yeah.
And on the top right-hand corner, you see a little window there with a magnifying glass. You type in whatever subject you want information on, and you'll find it. For example, if you some people claim that the human second chromosome 2, is an amalgamation of two chimp chromosomes. And there was. This seemed like a strong argument at one stage, but if you go onto our website and put in chromosome 2, you'll find articles about that in detail, far more than we can talk about here tonight.
Yeah.
And all sorts of other stuff, Archaeopteryx and Homo habilis, and, if you want stuff about Denisovans, which have been in the news lately, Flores, the one from Flores Island in Indonesia, Homo floresiensis, it was been called. You know, whatever you like. It's amazing what's on there. There's over 12,000 articles. And by the way, there's about several thousand articles in other languages as well. So if you've got stuff people that know, German, Korean, Chinese, you name it.
We've got a lot of international listeners, so
That's
I'm sure
right.
they'll find something that's useful there. So.
There's over 40 other languages, so other than English. So.
Well, that's excellent. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being so generous with your time and sitting down and having a chat with us. So
thanks, Luke.
Thank you for
It's
that.
great to be with you.
No worries. Maybe next time you're back in town, well, we can go for a part 2.
Yeah.
No worries. Well, everybody, if you have enjoyed the discussion tonight, please share this with a friend. And I know it's been really educational for us, and I'm sure it will be for those that you know as well. So share this around to answer people's questions, because this is something that's on a lot of people's minds. So thank you for writing out the episode with us, and we look forward to catching you for another episode next week. Done.
It's only 7:40. What are you doing, Luke?